Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. A quiet farmer, an old stone barn, and a ruthless HOA president on a power trip. When Leonard Walker refuses to bow to their demands, a tense battle ignites. As lies, break-ins, and forged claims pile up, Len must defend his land or watch his family's legacy be stolen. My name is Leonard Len Walker, and if you had told me a year ago that I'd be preparing for war over an old stone barn, I would have laughed in your face. But here I am, 42 years old, standing on the porch of a 600-acre farm I inherited from my grandfather, watching the sun dip below the hills, wondering just how far the people from Maple Hill HOA will go. This land has been in my family for generations. My grandfather, Harold Walker, bought it back in the 40s when returning soldiers wanted land and space to build something of their own. He worked the fields himself, raised cattle, built the stone barn with his own hands. That barn, now my workshop, has always been the heart of the property. It's where Grandpa taught me how to sand wood smooth, how to fix broken hinges, how to carve out something beautiful from a raw block. When he passed, he left me the entire estate, and though the upkeep is a constant grind, I love this place more than I can explain. For years, the farm was tucked away from suburban sprawl, safe behind a weathered post and wire fence. But over time, neighborhoods crept closer, and 5 years ago, the Maple Hill Estates development popped up less than half a mile from my western boundary. I didn't think much of it. They had their little community with matching mailboxes and freshly paved streets, all overseen by a homeowners association that liked to police the shade of garden gnomes and the height of hedges. Fine. They stayed on their side, and I stayed on mine. But things changed when Marcia Bloom took over as president of Maple Hill HOA. Not a Karen by name, but worse in every way. She was sharp, relentless, and had that unsettling ability to smile while issuing a threat. At first, I just noticed her name on some letters I tossed unopened into the recycling bin, thinking they were mistakenly sent. But then they became more targeted, more personal. One letter arrived in a heavy envelope with the HOA seal printed on it. It read, "We have observed that your barn structure is clearly visible from Maple Hill Estates, and we request access to inspect it for safety and code compliance." Another followed, stating, "Historic property lines in this area were once shared. For community purposes, we believe part of your land may fall under shared rights." And then, the boldest yet, to ensure emergency access, the HOA requests duplicate keys to all barns and storage units on the property. My first instinct was to laugh. I sat there on the porch with a beer in hand, shaking my head at the sheer absurdity. This farm isn't part of any HOA. It predates their existence by a good 70 years. But as the days passed, the tone of the letters sharpened, each one more assertive, acting like my ownership was just a misunderstanding, waiting to be corrected. I responded formally, of course, with polite but firm legal language, making it clear they had no jurisdiction over my land. I even had my lawyer draft a letter laying out the property lines, the deeds, the surveys. I figured that would put an end to it, but I started noticing cars I didn't recognize idling near my fences. People on foot walking just beyond the property line, pausing to take photos. A couple of times, I even saw HOA-branded SUVs parked near the western boundary, their drivers looking around with the kind of curiosity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's when the unease settled in my gut. This wasn't just a paperwork mix-up. Marcia and her people weren't letting go, and as I stood there one evening, watching the last of the daylight slip away, I realized that this wasn't going to stay polite for long. It was late Thursday afternoon when the first real crack in the dam appeared. I'd just come back from town, the back of my old Ford loaded with lumber for a new pergola I was planning to build beside the barn. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up the long driveway, the old farmhouse sitting quietly ahead, and for a moment, everything looked normal. But then I saw them, two men standing near the stone barn wearing matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, one with a tablet in hand, the other holding a clipboard. I slammed the truck door shut, heart already picking up. I hadn't seen anyone pass the front gate. How had they even gotten onto my land? My boots kicked up dust as I marched over, the smell of warm grass and hay thick in the air. "Excuse me," I called, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" They turned, surprised but not ashamed. The taller one, probably mid-40s with thinning hair, offered a practiced smile. "Hi there. We're just conducting a preliminary inspection on behalf of Maple Hill HOA. He tapped his tablet casually. You should have received notice by mail. I felt my blood pressure spike. You're trespassing on private property, I said, voice steady but cold. I don't care what letters you sent. This land isn't under your authority. The shorter guy, younger and more nervous, stepped back slightly, but the leader didn't even flinch. Sir, we're simply gathering observations. It's come to our attention that some structures here may present a safety concern visible from the HOA's boundary. We have a responsibility. I cut him off sharply. No, you don't. You have no responsibility, no authority, no right to be here. Leave now before I call the sheriff. That seemed to rattle them. The tall one tried a half-hearted protest, something about just doing their job, but I wasn't in the mood. I stood my ground, fists clenched at my sides, waiting. Finally, they backed down, muttering something under their breath as they walked briskly back toward a side gate. My heart thudded in my ears as I watched them go. As soon as they were out of sight, I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Frank. Frank was calm and sharp, the kind of guy who didn't get rattled easily. I explained what had just happened, pacing back and forth in front of the barn, feeling the heat rise in my face. They set foot on your land without permission, Frank asked, his voice low and measured. Send me any letters they've sent, and I'll draft them an official cease and desist. By the next morning, the document was on its way to Maple Hill HOA with clear warnings. Any further attempts to inspect, enter, or claim authority over my property would be met with legal action. I signed it with grim satisfaction, thinking this would be the end of it. But that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned copper and violet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just drawn a line in the sand, one Marcia Bloom was itching to cross. Saturday came with the kind of calm that tricks you into thinking the storm has passed. I spent the morning working in the barn, the smell of freshly sanded pine filling the air as I shaped boards for the pergola project. The old stone walls kept the space cool, even as the midday sun scorched the fields outside. For the first time all week, I felt myself relax. I figured the cease and desist letter had done its job. Surely even Marcia Bloom knew when to back off. But just after lunch, as I was wiping sweat from my brow and considering calling it a day, I heard the sharp crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, not the familiar rumble of my truck, but the crisp, official sound of a patrol car. I stepped out of the barn, wiping my hands on a rag, and sure enough, a county sheriff's vehicle was pulling up, lights off but unmistakably purposeful. 2 officers climbed out, one older with a thick mustache and weary eyes, the other younger, trying a little too hard to look authoritative. "Mr. Walker," the older one called. "That's me," I said cautiously, walking over. "What's this about, officers?" The younger cop stepped forward. "We received a 911 call from the Maple Hill Homeowners Association. They've reported concerns about potential code violations and hazardous materials being stored on the premises, specifically in that barn." He nodded toward my workshop. I stared at them, stunned for a second, before a bitter laugh escaped my mouth. "You've got to be kidding me." "Mind if we take a look around, sir?" the younger one added, his hand resting casually near his belt. "I do mind," I said firmly. "This is private property, gentlemen. I'm not under your jurisdiction for code inspections, and there are no hazardous materials here." The older cop raised his hands slightly, palms out. "Look, Mr. Walker, we understand. Honestly, this call sounded strange to us too. But once 911 is involved, we have to follow up. Can you at least show us some documentation so we can close this out and be on our way?" I exhaled slowly, biting back the irritation. "Yeah, give me a minute." I walked them to the farmhouse, pulling out the binder of land deeds, property surveys, and official permits, everything showing that my land sat well outside the HOA's reach. I even showed them photos of the barn's interior from last month's insurance inspection, neatly cataloged and dated. The older officer flipped through the papers with a slow, deliberate nod. "Looks solid to me," he murmured, shooting his partner a look. The younger one frowned, clearly not thrilled to have been dragged out here on what amounted to a neighbor dispute. "All right, Mr. Walker, sorry for the trouble. We'll make a note that the call was handled and there's no cause for concern." I thanked them, though inside my blood was still boiling. As they drove off, I stood there in the driveway, watching the patrol car disappear down the road. My fists clenched involuntarily. Marcia Bloom wasn't just playing at petty letters and idle threats anymore. She'd escalated this into something dangerous, something designed to wear me down or trap me into making a mistake. I spent the rest of that day checking the locks, walking the perimeter, installing 2 extra motion-activated cameras I'd ordered earlier that week just in case. The old stone barn that once felt like a haven now loomed like a target. Somehow, I knew deep down this wasn't the last time I'd see flashing lights at my gate. And the next time, it might not be a polite conversation with the sheriff. It was just past midnight 2 nights later when the sound jolted me awake. A sharp, metallic clatter followed by a low, muffled thud. My heart jumped straight into my throat. For a split second, I thought maybe it was just the wind rattling the old barn doors. But no. The night was still, the air heavy and silent. I slipped out of bed, bare feet hitting the wooden floor, and crept to the window. The moon hung low over the fields, casting long silver shadows, and in the faint glow from the barn's motion light, I saw them. 3 figures clustered near the stone barn, flashlights flickering over the heavy padlocks on the main doors. Adrenaline surged through me. I yanked on my jeans and boots, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? This is Leonard Walker, 238 County Line Road. There's a break-in happening on my property right now, by the barn. Send officers, please. The dispatcher confirmed help was on the way, but I knew it could take time for the nearest patrol to reach me out here. My eyes flicked to the corner by the door where my shotgun leaned, loaded and legal, like any good farm owners would be. I grabbed it, heart pounding, and stepped outside. As soon as my boots hit the porch steps, the night air hit me, crisp, cool, carrying the sharp scent of cut grass and hay. I approached slowly, keeping the shotgun lowered but visible, and called out, "Hey, you on my property. Step away from the building now." The flashlight swung toward me. One of the men, older in a security uniform, raised a hand. "Sir, we're with Maple Hill HOA. We were authorized to inspect this structure tonight." His voice was smug, confident, like he really believed that would fly. I nearly laughed. "Authorized by who?" "Not me." The younger man beside him stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We have papers. President Bloom signed them. This barn is part of shared community interest." "Bullshit," I snapped. "This is private land. Step away right now, or you're trespassing." I held the line, breath tight in my chest, as the seconds stretched. Then, in the distance, blue and red lights flared, 3 sheriff's cruisers roaring up the driveway, tires spitting gravel. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The men backed up fast, trying to explain themselves as the deputies climbed out. "We were just following HOA orders," the older guard stammered. "We thought we had authorization." One of the officers, a tall, broad man with a firm voice, cut him off. "Do you have a court order? Any official jurisdiction over this property?" Silence. "Didn't think so," the officer muttered. He turned to me. "Mr. Walker, can we see your ownership papers again?" I handed over the binder I'd brought with me, and while they reviewed it, I explained the whole twisted buildup. The letters, the trespassers, the 911 calls, and now this. The officers' faces grew darker with each detail. Within the hour, they were pulling Marcia Bloom herself onto the scene, summoned from her home, robe and all, by her hired guards. She arrived furious, sputtering that she had every right to manage the barn because the community has historical stakes in the property. But when the officers pressed her for proof, all she had were flimsy, suspiciously fresh documents, none of which matched the county's official records. That was the moment it all cracked open. Marcia's confident mask faltered. She was arrested on the spot for attempted trespass, forgery, and conspiracy to commit unlawful entry. As she was led to the squad car, her voice rose in shrill protest, promising lawsuits, swearing I hadn't heard the last of her. But as the doors slammed shut behind her, I stood beside my old barn, shotgun still in hand, and thought, "Oh, Marcia, you've only just begun to lose." The morning after Marcia Bloom's arrest, I sat at my kitchen table, a mug of black coffee going, cold in my hands as I stared at the pile of paperwork the officers had left me. It was surreal. Just 12 hours earlier, I'd been standing outside in the moonlight, facing down hired guards at gunpoint. Now I was reading through copies of forged documents that claimed, unbelievably, that my family's land had been shared community property for decades. My lawyer, Frank, arrived mid-morning, his briefcase in hand and a grim set to his mouth. He spread the documents across the table, running his fingers over the phony signatures, the faked notary stamps, the fabricated plat maps. "This," he muttered, "is sloppy but dangerous. It's the kind of thing a judge can't just ignore. Even if we know it's fake, The HOA leadership was planning to use this as a wedge to challenge your ownership. I leaned back, rubbing a hand over my face. So they weren't just harassing me for fun. They were gearing up for a takeover. Frank nodded. Marcia overplayed her hand by sending in security before filing anything official, but don't be fooled. This wasn't a one-woman scheme. She had backing from at least part of the HOA board. We're going to need to prepare a formal complaint. The next few days were a blur of meetings, filings, and interviews. The sheriff's department opened an investigation questioning not just Marcia but her inner circle, several HOA board members who had signed off on the inspection initiative, knowing full well they had no claim to my land. One of them cracked under questioning, revealing that Marcia had been pushing for an aggressive expansion of Maple Hill HOA's boundaries, hoping to annex nearby properties, including mine, into their governance zone. I wasn't the only target, I learned. 2 other neighboring landowners had received similar letters, but hadn't yet been hit with the kind of on-the-ground harassment I'd faced. My case, though, had exposed the rot at the core of their operation. Meanwhile, public pressure was mounting. The local news caught wind of the story. Rogue HOA president arrested in property takeover attempt, and soon cameras were showing up at the gate. Reporters asked me for statements, but I kept it simple. This is private land. Always has been. I'm standing up for my rights. What struck me the most, though, were the neighbors who came by in person, folks I barely knew before, to offer their support. Some brought pies, others just words of encouragement, shaking my hand firmly, saying they were glad someone was pushing back. It was a strange, unexpected solidarity that made me feel less alone on this vast stretch of farmland. Frank, meanwhile, was building the legal case. He compiled everything. Copies of the forged documents, security footage from the night of the break-in, witness statements from the guards and HOA board, and, most damning of all, the recorded phone calls Marcia had made to her board, boasting about bringing that old farm under control. Every piece stacked neatly into a mountain of evidence. Frank's face lit up with fierce satisfaction as he worked through the files. "We're not just defending your property, Len," he told me one night over the phone. "We're going after them for damages. And after this, no HOA in the county is going to touch you or anyone else near you again." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a slow, cautious smile. They had tried to break in, to intimidate, to twist the law into a weapon, but all they had done was hand me the ammunition to bring them down, and I was ready. Walking into the courthouse 3 weeks later, I felt the weight of it all settle on my shoulders. Not just the personal fight, but the bigger war I'd stepped into. It wasn't just about one barn anymore. It was about standing up to an entire organization that thought it could rewrite property lines, bully private landowners, and twist small-town politics to serve its own power. Frank walked beside me, crisp in his navy blue suit, clutching the leather folder stuffed with documents and exhibits. He radiated the calm, sharp focus of a man who lived for these kinds of fights. "Remember," he murmured as we passed the security checkpoint, "we don't need to win the whole war today. We just need to hit them hard enough they start to crumble." Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy, almost electric. On one side sat the HOA's legal team, 4 polished attorneys in sharp suits, whispering urgently among themselves. Marcia Bloom was there too, her once confident posture deflated, hair pulled tight, face pale under courtroom lights. Her board members sat clustered nearby, nervously flipping through papers. On our side, it was just me, Frank, and a stack of damning evidence, but we had the truth. The judge, a wiry, sharp-eyed man with a reputation for having no patience for nonsense, listened closely as Frank laid out the case. He presented the forged documents, pointed out inconsistencies, and highlighted the fact that no legal filing had ever been made to annex my property. The only evidence the HOA had were internal notes and fake papers created without any county oversight. One by one, the HOA's claims crumbled. Their lawyer tried to argue historical use rights. Frank countered with decades-old property surveys. They suggested shared community interest. Frank produced county zoning maps and tax records showing the clear division. They claimed Marcia was acting alone. Frank revealed board meeting minutes where multiple members had voted to approve the plan. And then came the witnesses. The HOA guards who'd been hired to break in testified, admitting they'd been told by Marcia that everything was above board, that the HOA had rights over the barn. But under cross-examination, they admitted they'd never seen a court order, never been shown real ownership documents. The sheriff's deputy testified next, explaining the night of the break-in and how quickly the investigation had revealed the forgery. The judge's expression darkened visibly at that point. By the afternoon, it was clear the HOA was in deep trouble. Frank filed a motion for damages, compensation for property damage, compensation for emotional distress, legal fees, and, crucially, a restraining order permanently barring the HOA from any further claims or actions against my property. When Frank finished, he sat down calmly while the HOA's lead attorney looked like he was physically deflating in his chair. Marcia, meanwhile, buried her face in her hands, trembling slightly. The judge called a recess, promising a ruling by the end of the week. As we stepped outside into the fresh air, Frank clapped a hand on my shoulder. "We didn't just put them on defense," he said quietly. "We just put the first nail in their coffin." For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. They had thrown everything they had at me, and I was still standing. The ruling came faster than anyone expected. By Friday afternoon, Frank called me with a grin in his voice. "Len," he said, "you might want to sit down." I was already sitting, perched on the edge of the porch swing, staring out over the fields as the late sun painted everything gold. "Hit me," I said. The judge ruled in our favor. Full damages awarded, $1.5 million. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the phone tighter. "You're kidding." "Nope. And that's not all. He issued a permanent injunction against Maple Hill HOA. They are barred from making any claims or taking any actions against your land in perpetuity. Marcia Bloom is personally liable for part of the damages, thanks to the criminal charges tied to the forgery. Her board backed her illegal moves, so the HOA is financially on the hook too." I stood slowly, staring out at the horizon as a strange, fierce joy bubbled up in my chest. "They're finished," I murmured. Frank chuckled. "Oh, they're worse than finished. Word's already spreading. Half the neighborhood is pulling out of the HOA entirely. No one wants to pay dues to a sinking ship." The next few days were a blur of local headlines, calls from reporters, and stunned messages from neighbors I barely knew. People dropped by in person just to shake my hand or thank me for standing up when no one else dared. Some of them had their own horror stories, years of small-scale bullying by the HOA that they'd been too scared or too tired to fight. Now they were emboldened, watching the empire collapse. And Marcia. She was stripped of her title, fined personally by the court, and facing the fallout of both the civil judgment and her criminal charges. I heard she was packing up to leave town, though I couldn't confirm it. Frank told me to let it go, not to gloat, but I'll admit, there were a few moments when I allowed myself the private satisfaction of picturing her face as the world she'd built came crashing down. I spent one whole afternoon walking the boundary of my land, running my hand along the newly reinforced fences, checking the locks on the barn, the cameras, the motion sensors. My family's land was safe. My grandfather's legacy was safe, and no HOA or power-hungry president would ever threaten that again. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. A week after the ruling, I stood in front of the old stone barn, looking up at the fresh sign I'd just bolted to the wall, "Private property. HOA keep out. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The bold black letters gleamed against the pale stone, a clear, permanent message to anyone who thought they could walk onto my land uninvited. I took a step back, brushing the dust off my jeans, and allowed myself a long, satisfied breath. That Saturday, I hosted a big gathering, family, friends, and a few of the neighbors who'd supported me through the whole ordeal. We set up picnic tables under the big oak near the barn, fired up the grill, laid out coolers of drinks, and let the kids run wild across the pastures. Laughter and music filled the air, and for the first time in months, the farm felt light again. No tension, no watchful eyes, no creeping dread of another HOA letter showing up in the mailbox. People came up to me one by one, shaking my hand, clapping me on the back, raising a glass in my honor. Some shared their own frustrations with the HOA, while others just wanted to say thank you for standing up, for showing it was possible to fight back and win. I realized that somewhere along the way, this had become more than just a personal battle. It had become a symbol of resistance, of protecting what's yours against those who think power gives them the right to take it. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the fields, I walked over to the edge of the property. In the distance, I could see the rooftops of Maple Hill Estates, their perfectly matched lines and manicured lawns now quiet and strangely small-looking. The once confident HOA had gone eerily silent. Their online pages shut down, their meetings canceled, their president disgraced. Word around town was that dozens of homeowners were withdrawing their memberships, no longer willing to pay fees to an organization that had been so thoroughly exposed. I smiled to myself, feeling a deep, grounded satisfaction that no amount of money could ever buy. My grandfather's farm was intact, my family's name protected, and the people who had tried to bully and scheme their way into stealing what wasn't theirs had been humiliated in open court. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the stars were bright overhead, I sat alone on the porch, a glass of bourbon in hand. I looked out across the fields, past the dark silhouette of the barn, past the fences I'd rebuilt, and I felt something settle inside me. Not just peace, but pride. They had tried everything: threats, paperwork, fake documents, intimidation, even force. But in the end, I had held my ground. I had defended what was mine, and I knew now more than ever that I was ready for whatever came next. Because out here, on 600 acres of hard-won land, there's only one truth that matters. This is my home, and no one takes it from me.